So another thing that happened in Zephaniah was, of course, his prophecy to the people about God's judgment. The thing that was really cool about this is that God did come through, and we know that now, even though the people might have been confused at the time. One author puts it that God intervened in his own court presentation. In his beckoning words, he interrupts his accusation and pleads for reform and brings a bright hope. So that's something that we can always see throughout the story of Zephaniah. So Zephaniah is prophesying, and the main thing that he is prophesying about is God's approaching judgment, and he's prophesying to the people of Judah. And during this time, there was a lot of political conflict, there was a lot of social issues, and just a lot of things that were going on in the time. Zephaniah came to the hands of Babylon, and they overpowered Assyria and brought the ancient power to an end. That was something else that happened during this time, and things that were going on during the time of the history. So today I want to talk to you guys about Zephaniah, and not only that, but the context and background of his book. So at the time, Zephaniah, he was prophesying under the rule of King Josiah, or like during the time of his kingship. Zephaniah was probably a person who was very well known in the time of Judah, and he lived through just a lot of the different history, both through the fall and through some of the rebuilding as well. He prophesied between about 640 to 609, and during this time, all of the things that he was prophesying and preaching and teaching about had to do with God and his... You can keep that though, because I'll...
So some of the things we were talking about while reading and studying this book, and this prophet in particular, was firstly, why was this book placed where it was within the Old Testament? The answer we all agreed on simply was that it fit into the context in which surrounded it. The people during this time were constantly disobeying God and disobeying God's orders as given through the prophets, such as Zephaniah. So the Old Testament, there's a lot of evidence of people and tribes who were disobeying God's command to them, and that is even frequent today. And then ultimately there is punishment for that disobedience, for that sin, as offered up by the prophets. This book also fit into where it was placed in the Old Testament simply because it was surrounded by the other minor prophets who also talked about consequences for the people's sin and disobedience. But similarly, they all offered up some type of hope for them, a promise of restoration, a promise of fulfillment, and that no matter what circumstance they are in or what they are going through, ultimately there will be healing, they will be freed from their captivity, their bondage, and they will be restored to the first covenant that God made for them, which is that they will prosper, they will ultimately serve one God, which is Yahweh, and everything will kind of come together for their good. Another note that we made was, what did this mean for the people of Israel during the time it was written? So similar to what I was just saying was that these people had a trend of disobedience and disregarding God's command. So Zephaniah wrote this as a means of warning and for them to take caution. So some imagery was used to explain the judgment that God will place on them and how it will impact them in the coming years after that, and how that will affect them, especially in the time and place they were at. Another note that I made was that, similar to other prophets, they all follow the same trend of explaining in descriptive detail, metaphors, imagery of how God's wrath on them would look. And this could often be portrayed as maybe evil or violent. And some believe that the God of the Old Testament is very different from the God of the New Testament, in the sense that the New Testament God is often viewed as loving, caring, wanting to fulfill the people's needs, but ultimately it is the Old Testament God that is often seen as vengeful, is very similar to the New Testament God, because they are ultimately the same God. They are ultimately trying to fulfill the same promise of freedom and the breaking of their captivity, whether that is by humans or mentally, spiritually. uh, ultimately it is God's desire for us to all serve Him instead of idols, false gods, stuff like that. So what this means for us New Testament believers today is that these warnings they should be something that we think about often. Sin is something that plagues everybody, regardless of if you're a pastor, for example, or if you're a teacher, whatever the case may be. Everyone is plagued by sin because of original sin when Adam sinned against God in the garden. So Zephaniah is ultimately reminding us New Testament believers that although there is punishment for our sins, our disobedience, there is hope to be found in the one God that exists, that we all are called to serve.
Okay, so after hearing about Zephaniah's background and context and the content of his message, the question now becomes, what do we do with all of this? Right? Why is this book relevant to us today? And what do we do with it moving forward? And so Zephaniah is unique in that among all of the prophets, it presents some of the most dark and bleak images of God's judgment using very distinct language. In the first chapter of Zephaniah, we see him use language that describes the reversal of Genesis 1, where the orderly, good creation of God's world is reverted back into this primordial darkness and watery flood that it was before God brought order and peace to it. All of this because of Israel's sin. And so we see this very brutal, damaging picture of Israel's sin and everything that they've done. And so Zephaniah forces us to take that dark, bleak judgment that we see our God render and take it side by side with his love, and showing that there is hope for Judah, in that God does not judge in order to destroy or harm, but he judges in order to purify. And he does that out of love, because his heart, his goal is to take a remnant out of Judah and to create an environment that is spiritually, emotionally, and physically peaceful and joyful for them. But he can only do that through the judgment that he will render on the wicked. So it's only by eliminating the weeds that the true crops can prosper. And so Zephaniah forces us to take a look at our own theology and what we often consider to be the actions of a good and loving God, and to take them into consideration with his judgment, in that a good and loving God in a broken world such as ours will have to render judgment in order to create a space that is purified and good for his true children to live in. So what do we do with that as disciples moving forward? Well, living in the New Testament, we as believers tend to have this fairy tale image of God, that because he is a God of love, and because he is a God of peace, and because he is a God of joy, he is above judgment. That's the God of the Old Testament. That's a God of darkness. That's a God of violence. We don't serve that God. We serve the God that Jesus told us about. But Zephaniah challenges us, even in the Old Testament, to consider that perhaps the God of the Old Testament is capable of love and joy and peace. And perhaps the God of the New Testament is capable of judgment and darkness. And perhaps they're not two different gods, but the same God. And that God's judgment isn't an antithesis to his desire for love and peace, but it is actually the way that he prepares an environment of love and joy and peace. And it even reflects in the words of, later on, his son, Jesus, who says that the weeds cannot be pulled out just yet because they will uproot the true crops. And so in the end of days, the weeds will be separated from the true crops and burned separately, which sounds harsh, but the goal is that there would be purification, that what's left, the remnant of his people, would have an environment that is safe and that allows them to flourish with their God in his presence. And so, more than anything, Zephaniah truly challenges us as disciples and Christians today to not disregard or put off to the side God's judgment and his anger and his wrath, but rather to consider it a good thing from a good God out of his holiness, because it is through that judgment and it is through that wrath that we so tend to put behind us or try to shove in the closet, that God paves the way for his people, the ones that he loves, to have an environment of flourishing, an environment of true growth and enjoyment of him and his creation.